The crystal chandelier above our table scattered tiny rainbows across my wine glass as Dorian reached into his briefcase and drew out a cream-colored envelope. My name was penned on it in his assistant's handwriting, and something about the way he slid it toward me made my entire world tilt sideways. "Thanks for 8 incredible years, Nyla," he said. That same warm smile he'd worn when he'd invited me to this absurdly expensive restaurant an hour earlier. "Unfortunately, we're restructuring your division. This is effective immediately." I stared at that envelope like it might bite me. 8 years. 8 years of 60-hour weeks, of missing my nephew's first steps because I was trapped in client meetings, of building relationships that turned our failing department into the company's top earner. And he was ending it between courses at some overpriced place that charged $40 for a single piece of fish. My name is Nyla. I'm 31 years old, and I thought I understood betrayal until that moment. Before I go any further, could you take a few seconds to tell me in the comments where you're listening from? I want to know where my story is reaching people. And also like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon, because what comes next will blow your mind. And I promise, you've never heard a revenge story quite like this one. I opened that envelope with steady hands, even though everything inside me was screaming. Termination papers, legal jargon about immediate cessation of duties, a severance package that was decent, but far from enough for what I had given them. "I hope you understand this isn't personal," Dorian continued, slicing into his steak like nothing had shifted. "It's just business. The board wants to streamline operations." Just business. That phrase echoed in my mind as I folded the papers and slipped them back into the envelope. I looked at the man I'd worked beside for 8 years, whom I'd helped make millions of dollars, whom I'd trusted with my career and future. "Of course," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Can you tell me more about the severance timeline?" He looked relieved that I wasn't crying or making a scene. "Smart girl," he said, and those 2 words hit me harder than the termination itself. Smart girl. As if I were some intern he was patting on the head instead of the woman who had single-handedly saved his reputation more times than I could count. What Dorian didn't realize was that I'd been observing him closely for months. Not because I suspected anything like this, but because something had felt off in our department's numbers. Resources that should have been allocated to us kept vanishing. Projects that should have been greenlit kept getting stalled. And meanwhile, he'd been holding numerous mysterious meetings with the executive team. I'd also been hearing whispers from clients about a potential acquisition our company had its eye on. A smaller competitor called Zenith Technologies, struggling publicly but holding incredibly valuable patents in artificial intelligence. Patents worth hundreds of millions to whoever owned them. The pieces had begun clicking together about 2 weeks before this lunch. I had stayed late one evening when I saw Dorian in his office, door closed, deep in what looked like an intense phone conversation. Through the glass, I could see spreadsheets on his computer, and something in his posture told me this wasn't a routine business call. The next morning, I did some digging. Not hacking or anything illegal, just using my legitimate access to financial reports and project databases. What I discovered made my blood run cold. Dorian had been methodically redirecting resources away from my division and into others, then using our artificially poor performance to argue that we needed restructuring. Meanwhile, he was building a case to the board that Zenith Technologies was a failing company worth buying at a bargain price. But here's the thing about those patents everyone coveted. I had worked with some of Zenith's engineers at my previous company. I knew their technology was revolutionary, not outdated, as Dorian claimed in his reports. He was deliberately undervaluing them to keep their stock low until our acquisition was complete. My firing wasn't about restructuring. It was about eliminating the one person who might expose his carefully constructed scheme. As we finished our meal, I watched Dorian check his phone repeatedly. He seemed nervous, which was unusual for him. He'd always been the kind of executive who stayed calm under pressure. But today, there was something different in his energy. "Is everything all right?" I asked, genuinely curious. Oh, just some bored stuff, he replied dismissively. Nothing you need to worry about anymore. That remark stung, but I kept my face neutral. We made small talk about the weather and my plans during the transition period. He offered to write me a recommendation letter, which felt like rubbing salt into a wound. I was still trying to process everything. When the check arrived, he insisted on paying, which somehow made it feel even worse. Like this lavish lunch was meant to soften the blow of destroying my career. I really do wish things could have been different, he said as we stood to leave. You're incredibly talented, Nyla. I'm sure you'll land on your feet. I thanked him for lunch and walked to my car in a daze. It wasn't until I was sitting in the parking garage that the full reality sank in. I was unemployed. After 8 years of dedicated service, I was starting over from scratch. But as I sat there, something shifted inside me. The hurt began turning into something sharper, more precise. Dorian had made a mistake firing me this way. He'd underestimated what I knew and what I was capable of. That evening, I began making a list. Not a revenge fantasy, but a careful inventory of everything I knew about the Zenith acquisition and Dorian's financial manipulations. I had access to reports, emails, and client conversations that told a very different story than what he was presenting to the board. I also started thinking about my network. 8 years in this industry had given me relationships far beyond my former company, including my old professor from graduate school, Dr. Elena Vasquez, who had become one of the most respected industry analysts in the country. The next morning, I called Elena and asked if she'd like to meet for coffee. We had stayed in touch over the years, and she had always been generous with her time whenever I had questions about market trends or needed a second opinion on analysis. I'm working on some interesting research about undervalued assets in our sector, I told her over the phone. I'd love to get your perspective on some patterns I'm noticing. We met at a small cafe downtown, the kind of place where industry people went to have conversations they didn't want overheard in corporate lobbies. Elena was exactly as I remembered her, brilliant, direct, and always eager to discuss market inefficiencies. So, what's this research you're working on? She asked after we caught up on personal news. I chose my words carefully. I've been looking at some companies that appear to be trading below their true value based on technological assets. Specifically, I'm noticing a disconnect between public perception and the underlying innovation in the AI patent space. Elena's eyes lit up. This was exactly the kind of market analysis she thrived on. Can you give me a concrete example? Have you looked at Zenith Technologies recently? I asked. Their stock had been falling for months, but when I examined their patent portfolio and the engineers they had hired, there was a real mismatch between market perception and actual capability. Elena pulled out her tablet and started taking notes. That's interesting. I haven't done a deep dive on them recently. What specifically are you noticing? I spent the next hour walking her through publicly available information about Zenith's patents, their hiring patterns, and their research publications. Everything I shared was public record or information I had legitimately gathered through client relationships. I never mentioned the acquisition or my suspicions about Dorian's manipulations. This is fascinating, Elena said when I finished. If you're correct about their technological capabilities, their current valuation makes no sense. That's exactly what I was thinking, I replied. It seems like the market is overlooking something substantial here. Elena left that coffee meeting energized by a potential research opportunity. I left feeling like I had planted a seed that could grow into something much bigger. 3 days later, Elena published a detailed analysis titled Hidden Innovation, Overlooked Value in AI Patent Leaders. The report spotlighted Zenith Technologies as a company whose market value did not reflect its real technological assets. The impact was immediate. Zenith's stock price jumped 38% on the first day of trading after the report's release. Financial news outlets picked up the story, and suddenly everyone was talking about the hidden gem analysts had been ignoring. I watched the stock price climb from my apartment, feeling a mix of satisfaction and anticipation. This was just the beginning, but I wasn't finished. While Elena's report had disrupted Dorian's acquisition timeline, I had even bigger plans. During our termination lunch, I had noticed something he probably thought I hadn't. When Dorian excused himself to take a phone call, I had glanced at his open planner. Call it curiosity or instinct, but something about the way he'd guarded it all lunch made me want to see what was so important. The page was filled with numbers and dates that didn't match anything I recognized from our standard financial reports. Revenue figures that differed from what we'd been reporting internally. Budget allocations that seemed to shuffle money between departments in ways that made no sense. I didn't take photos or steal anything. I simply looked at those numbers and committed them to memory, the same way I had trained myself to remember client details and project specifications. Over the next few days, I cross-referenced those figures with reports I had saved from previous quarters. I had always been meticulous about keeping copies of important documents, partly because I liked having comprehensive records, and partly because I had learned not to trust that information would always be available when I needed it. The patterns that emerged were damning. Dorian had been systematically moving resources away from my division and into accounts that made our performance look worse than it truly was. Then he had used our artificially poor results to justify arguments about market conditions and acquisition opportunities. It was sophisticated financial manipulation designed to craft a narrative that would benefit his career and acquisition plans. And it had worked perfectly, until Elena's report disrupted his timeline. I had contact information for 3 board members from previous projects where I had presented directly to leadership. These weren't social connections, but professional contacts who knew my work and had expressed respect for my analysis in the past. I spent an entire weekend drafting a memo that outlined the financial discrepancies I had discovered. I was careful to present everything as questions rather than accusations. I included supporting documentation that clearly showed the patterns without relying on any confidential information. I've been reviewing historical financial reports and noticed some discrepancies that may warrant further investigation, I wrote in my cover email. Given my recent transition away from the company, I thought it was important to bring these concerns to your attention before they become more difficult to address. I sent the memo to all 3 board members on a Sunday evening, then spent Monday distracting myself with job searching and apartment cleaning. I had no idea if they would take my concerns seriously, or if they would even read my analysis. Tuesday morning, I received a call from an unknown number. Nyla, this is Patricia Hricks from the board. I received your memo about the financial discrepancies. Can you make yourself available for a conversation this week? Patricia was the board member I had worked with most closely on a major client presentation 2 years earlier. She was known for being thorough and fair, but also for not tolerating financial irregularities. Of course, I said, trying to keep the excitement out of my voice. I'm available whenever works for your schedule. We scheduled a call for Thursday morning. By Wednesday evening, Patricia called back. Nyla, I need to ask you not to discuss your memo with anyone else for the time being. We're bringing in external auditors to review the concerns you've raised, and we want to make sure the investigation isn't compromised. External auditors. They were taking this seriously. The next 2 weeks felt like the longest of my life. I had no inside information about what was happening at my former company, but I began hearing rumors through my professional network. Whispers about financial reviews and executive meetings running longer than usual. Then Elena called me. Have you been following the news about your former company? She asked. I hadn't been. I had been deliberately avoiding industry news because it was too painful to read about the place that had discarded me. What news? I asked. They just announced that their acquisition of Zenith Technologies has been called off. Apparently, there were internal financial issues that needed to be resolved first. And there are rumors that your former boss is taking an extended leave of absence. Extended leave of absence. That was corporate speak for, "We're investigating you but haven't fired you yet." I felt a surge of satisfaction mixed with genuine surprise. I had hoped my memo would trigger some kind of review, but I hadn't expected results this quickly or this dramatically. A week later, the business press reported that Dorian had resigned to pursue other opportunities. The announcement came on the same day Zenith Technologies stock hit a new 12-month high, making any acquisition financially impossible for the foreseeable future. The irony was perfect. Dorian had fired me to protect an acquisition that was now completely out of reach, and his own manipulation had been exposed in the process. But I still wasn't satisfied. Getting Dorian fired felt like justice, but it didn't address the bigger question of what came next for me. I had been job searching for a month with limited success, and while I had decent savings, I needed to think strategically about my next move. That's when I got a call that changed everything. "Nyla, this is Marcus Webb, Chief Technology Officer at Zenith Technologies. I've been hearing a lot about your background and expertise from some mutual connections. I was wondering if you might be interested in discussing a potential opportunity with us." Zenith Technologies, the company at the center of this entire situation, wanted to talk to me about a job. Marcus and I met for lunch the following week at a restaurant that was nice, but not ostentatiously expensive. The contrast with my termination lunch wasn't lost on me. "I'll be direct," Marcus said after we'd ordered. "We know there was some corporate interest in acquiring us recently, and we know that interest has suddenly disappeared. We also know that someone with industry expertise helped highlight our actual value when the market was underestimating us." He paused, studying me carefully. "We've been asking around about who might have that kind of insight into both our technology and the acquisition landscape. Your name keeps coming up." I chose my words carefully. I've always believed that good technology gets recognized eventually. Sometimes the market just needs help seeing what's already there. Marcus smiled. "That's exactly the perspective we need as we think about our next phase of growth. We're looking for someone to lead our strategic partnerships and business development, someone who understands both the technology and the market dynamics." The role he described was basically my dream job, leading innovation partnerships at a company whose technology I genuinely believed in, with equity compensation that could be worth millions if they continued to grow. "There's one more thing," Marcus said as we finished our meal. "We've been considering acquiring some patents and smaller companies to accelerate our development. We'd want someone in this role to lead those efforts." I accepted their offer that afternoon. My first day at Zenith Technologies was exactly 6 weeks after Dorian had fired me over lunch. Instead of feeling defeated and disposable, I was stepping into a leadership role at one of the most innovative companies in our industry. But the real satisfaction came 2 months later when Marcus called me into his office with a proposition. "There's a portfolio of AI patents that just became available," he said. "The company that was trying to acquire them had some internal shakeup, and now they're looking to sell rather than develop them internally. The price is about 60% of what we would have paid 6 months ago." I knew exactly which patents he meant. They were the ones Dorian had been planning to acquire as part of his grand strategy, the ones that were supposed to make his career and cement his reputation as a visionary executive. "I think we should acquire them," I said. "They align perfectly with our development roadmap." The acquisition went through 3 weeks later. I signed the paperwork as Zenith's Director of Strategic Partnerships, acquiring the exact patents Dorian had coveted for a fraction of their original asking price. Sometimes revenge isn't about attacking someone directly. Sometimes it's about letting their own choices catch up with them while you build something better from the ashes they left behind. I never sent Dorian a message or called to gloat. I didn't need to. The industry is small enough that he certainly heard about my new role and our patent acquisition. He'd understand exactly what had happened and how his own actions had created the opportunity for my success. 6 months later, I heard through mutual connections that Dorian had taken a much smaller role at a mid-tier consulting firm. His reputation for strategic vision had been permanently damaged by the failed acquisition and the financial irregularities that had been uncovered. Meanwhile, Zenith Technologies had grown into one of the most talked about companies in our sector, and my equity stake was worth more than I had made in my entire 8 years at my previous company. The patents we acquired became the foundation for 3 new product lines, generating over $200 million in revenue in their first year alone. I think about that termination lunch sometimes, about how confident Dorian was when he slid that envelope across the table, how certain he was that he was removing an obstacle to his grand plan. He was right about one thing. I was an obstacle, just not in the way he thought. The beautiful irony is that if he had simply been honest with me about the company's direction, if he had included me in strategic planning instead of manipulating numbers to justify my removal, I probably would have helped him succeed. My client relationships and industry knowledge could have been assets to his acquisition strategy rather than threats. But he saw me as a smart girl who needed to be managed rather than a professional partner who could be trusted. That decision cost him everything he had been working toward and gave me everything I had been dreaming of. There's something poetic about the fact that his last day at the company came during a lunch meeting with the board chair at the same restaurant where he had fired me. I didn't attend his farewell gathering, but I heard it was a small, awkward affair with mostly junior staff who felt obligated to show up. By then, I was already deep into my new role, working with technology that was 3 years ahead of anything my former company was developing. If you've made it this far in my story, could you please hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you think about how things worked out? Also, subscribe if you want to hear more stories about how the business world really works behind all the polished press releases and corporate speak, because trust me, there are so many more stories where this one came from, and some are even crazier than what happened to me. The real story of what Dorian had been planning didn't fully come to light until almost a year later, when I was already settled into my new life at Zenith Technologies. I was in my office one Thursday morning when my assistant knocked on my door with an unusual expression. "Nyla, there's someone here to see you. Says it's about your previous employer. Her name is Jessica Chen, and she says she used to work in their legal department." I had never heard of Jessica Chen, but something about the way my assistant described her visit made me curious. "Send her in." Jessica was probably in her mid-40s, professionally dressed, but with the kind of tired eyes that suggested she'd been dealing with something stressful for a while. She sat down across from my desk and got straight to the point. "I know this is unusual, but I need to tell you something about what really happened at your former company, about Dorian Blackwell, and why you were really fired." The use of his full name caught my attention. Most people in our industry just called him Dorian. "I'm listening," I said carefully. Jessica took a deep breath. "I was the legal counsel who was asked to draft the termination paperwork for your division. But what I discovered while doing that research made me realize that your firing was part of something much bigger and far more problematic than a simple restructuring." She pulled out a folder and placed it on my desk. "I've been debating whether to share this information for months. But when I heard about your success here at Zenith, I decided you deserve to know the full truth." I opened the folder and found copies of internal emails, financial projections, and legal memos that painted a picture of Dorian's scheme even more elaborate than I had imagined. "He wasn't just manipulating departmental budgets," Jessica continued. "He was working with outside investors who planned to short Zenith's stock before the acquisition announcement, then cover their positions after the deal went through. Your performance data had threatened Dorian's entire timeline because it contradicted his narrative about market conditions. Short selling, he and his collaborators were planning to profit both from the acquisition and by betting against Zenith's stock price. It was sophisticated financial manipulation bordering on securities fraud." Jessica Chen, the legal counsel who had prepared my termination paperwork, revealed that my firing was designed to remove someone who could expose the scheme. She had quit because she couldn't be part of the cover-up. Emails and documents she shared showed Dorian had planned my removal weeks in advance, calling me a liability to his timeline, and spreadsheets projected over $400 million in potential gains from the acquisition and stock manipulation. They had been trying to destroy a company full of brilliant engineers while enriching themselves, but they failed completely. Zenith Technologies had thrived, growing 300%, our patents fueling innovation, and our stock price skyrocketing over 800%, all while Dorian's career crumbled. I shared Jessica's files with Elena Vasquez, whose investigative report 6 weeks later detailed the conspiracy without naming names, showing how the scheme backfired spectacularly. That day, I got a text congratulating me, but I focused on the future. 6 months later, I was promoted to Vice President of Strategic Innovation at Zenith Technologies, with an equity package worth more than I'd ever imagined, and a role that allowed me to shape the direction of the entire industry, all while Dorian's manipulations had spectacularly imploded. But the most satisfying moment came during an industry conference where I was giving a keynote on innovation partnerships. As I walked onto the stage, I noticed a familiar face in the back row. Dorian, notepad in hand, apparently trying to learn from the very presentation about the success strategies his scheme had unintentionally enabled. I didn't acknowledge him or alter my talk in any way. I delivered my prepared remarks on how authentic innovation requires trust, transparency, and long-term thinking rather than short-term manipulation. During the Q&A, someone asked about challenges in building strategic partnerships. I looked briefly at Dorian and said, I think the biggest challenge is working with people who see collaboration as a zero-sum game rather than an opportunity for mutual growth. When you encounter that mindset, sometimes the best strategy is to simply build something better and let the results speak for themselves. After the presentation, several executives approached me with partnership proposals, but Dorian did not. Later that evening, at the conference reception, he appeared with what looked like a prepared speech. I just wanted to say congratulations on your success, he said carefully. It's impressive what you've built at Zenith. The executives around us suddenly perked up, aware of the story everyone in the industry knew about my departure and Zenith's rise. Thank you, I replied simply. It's been an incredible opportunity to work with such innovative technology and talented people. I hope there are no hard feelings about how things ended at our previous company, Dorian added. Just business, you understand? Just business? The same phrase he'd used during our termination lunch. Of course, I said. I actually owe you a debt of gratitude. If you hadn't made the decisions you made, I never would have had the chance to be part of something this exciting. He paused, trying to gauge if I was sincere or sarcastic, while the executives sensed the tension. Well, he said awkwardly, I'm glad everything worked out for the best. It really did, I replied warmly. Sometimes what feels like an ending is just the beginning of something much better. He walked away confused and slightly defeated, and I returned to conversations with other executives, several immediately asking for partnership opportunities with Zenith. That night, lying in my hotel room, I reflected on how completely my life had transformed since that lunch 18 months earlier. I had gone from being a disposable employee to one of the most sought-after strategic minds in the industry. More than that, I had learned an important truth about resilience and revenge. The most powerful response to betrayal isn't destruction, it's creation. Building something so successful that your betrayer becomes irrelevant. Dorian had tried to eliminate me as a threat to his plans. Instead, he had freed me to challenge his entire worldview on business. A year later, I appeared on the cover of a major business magazine with the headline, The Innovation Disruptor. The article described how my approach to strategic partnerships was changing how technology companies approached growth and collaboration. When asked about my past experiences and what had motivated my success, I said, being underestimated can be an advantage. When people think they can dismiss or manipulate you, they stop noticing what you're truly capable of. That oversight creates opportunities for those willing to work strategically and think long-term. The journalist pressed for details about my transition between companies, but I focused on the positive impact of my current role rather than dwelling on past grievances. I concluded, your response to adversity defines your future far more than the adversity itself. You can choose to be bitter, or you can choose to be better. 3 years after my termination lunch, Zenith Technologies announced we were acquiring my former company's technology division. The same division that Dorian had worked so hard to manipulate was now being acquired by the very company he had tried to control. The irony was perfect. The company he'd aimed to acquire was now absorbing pieces of his former employer. I wasn't directly involved in the negotiation, but I reviewed the strategic assessment justifying the purchase. The conclusion was clear. While the target division had solid technology, their leadership and strategic vision had been inadequate for years. The acquisition went through smoothly, and most employees from my former division were retained, though several executives from Dorian's inner circle were not offered positions. By then, I had been promoted again, this time to Senior Vice President of Global Strategy, setting the long-term direction for a company valued at over $8 billion. Jessica's folder of documents stayed in my office filing cabinet, not because I needed them, but as a reminder of how quickly things can change when people underestimate the consequences of their actions. Former colleagues would sometimes ask about my luck in transitioning to Zenith just before their explosive growth. I'd always smile and say that preparation and opportunity tend to find each other. The truth was that nothing about what happened was luck. Dorian created the conditions for his own downfall by prioritizing short-term manipulation over long-term value creation, and I was simply positioned to benefit when his approach inevitably failed. Last month, I heard that Dorian had started his own consulting firm, helping struggling companies identify acquisition targets. The irony was not lost on me. I genuinely hope he's learned from his mistakes, not because I forgive him, but because I've moved so far beyond that chapter that his success or failure no longer affects my life. My current life is everything I dreamed of while working 60-hour weeks in my previous role. I lead a team of brilliant strategists, work with cutting-edge technology, and enjoy financial security that comes from building value rather than executing someone else's vision. But the most satisfying part isn't the money or recognition. It's knowing I've built something authentic and sustainable, something that creates value for everyone involved instead of extracting it through manipulation. The patents we acquired, the ones Dorian had coveted, became the foundation for technology now used by millions of people every day, products that make lives easier and more connected. That's the legacy I want to be part of. Thinking back to that termination lunch, I feel grateful rather than angry. Dorian thought he was ending my story, but he was merely editing out the boring chapters so the interesting part could begin. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, I need you to do something. Smash that like button because this shows what's possible when you refuse to let others define your worth. Leave a comment sharing a time someone underestimated you, because I want to hear how you prove them wrong. And subscribe with the notification bell on, because I have so many more stories revealing how the business world really works behind the polished corporate PR. The most important takeaway is this: when someone tries to diminish or discard you, they're usually revealing more about their limitations than yours. Your job isn't to get even. Your job is to make them irrelevant through creation and success. Sometimes the best response to betrayal isn't revenge, it's getting ahead.